Well, good evening and a very warm welcome on behalf of Milim to this evening's presentation. Welcome wherever you are in the UK and indeed wherever you are in the world. Our series of online talks and conversations continues with our guest Jeremy Silver. I'll introduce Jeremy in just a moment. Some housekeeping first. Please do ask questions. Do this by typing whatever you'd like to ask into the Q&A facility on your screen. As ever, we will do our best to get through as many of your questions as we can. There's also a chat facility you'll find on your screen, and you can use this to send a message to all of the other participants on this webinar, should you wish to do so. This event is being recorded, and you will find it on our website at milim.org.uk in the next couple of days. There you will also find recordings of other past events and details of our future programme for which you can book tickets. And so to our guest this evening. Jeremy Silver is an entrepreneur, an author and an angel investor. He is the CEO of Digital Catapult, the UK innovation agency for advanced digital technology, and he's a board member of the British Library. Jeremy has held extensive roles in the music industry as worldwide vice president of new media at EMI in Los Angeles and also head of media at Virgin Records. He's also held various roles in music technology businesses. Jeremy is the author of this book, Towards a Digital Renaissance, The Evolution of Creativity, Values and Business from Cyberspace to the Metaverse, which we will be discussing as we go forward. Jeremy, welcome to Milim. Thank you very much for being our guest this evening.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
Well, a pleasure to have you. Now, for those of us who haven't read your book, what's it about?
Well, that's a great question. I suppose in the end, this is a book about the way that the music industry responded to the internet, and interwoven with that is a series of thoughts and observations about the way in which entrepreneurs work and innovation works with entrepreneurship, and what the relationship between entrepreneurs and investors can be like, and perhaps what the future of some of our most interesting technological innovation might turn out to be as well. So it covers a lot of ground.
It certainly does, and it's a riveting read, highly recommended. Was there something particular that made you want to write this book?
I think I realized that I, by chance, found myself in the midst of some quite dramatic moments of change at various points in my what passes for a career, and I sort of thought, well, I should start to explain some of that and talk about some of that from my point of view, and I've had sort of quite a meandering life, I suppose, of working in different companies and different businesses, and in the experience of working with all of them in the midst of so much change, I thought it was something worth documenting. So I started, and once I'd started, it was sort of hard to know when to finish, actually. In fact, that was probably the most difficult thing about the whole thing, since technology is continuing to rush along at such an incredible pace.
You say, you write about your early career in the music industry, and you say you were at the heart of its glamour, wealth and pomp. Tell us something about that time, and I suppose how technology then threatened to disrupt that world that you were working in.
Well, it was an amazing time. I'd never intended to work in the music industry. That happened by some strange quirk of coincidence. And I started out as a publicist, and so my earliest experiences in the music industry in the early 90s were going on the road with Genesis, but not going to some major kind of stadium tour, by the way, but going a rather unglamorous tour of the town halls of England. They sort of thought it'd be good fun to go around and visit places like Wolverhampton Civic Centre as a refreshing change from having played the big stadia of America. So there was a slightly surreal feeling to it, and that kind of was my experience. Really, the whole thing felt quite surreal, and my time at Virgin was. It turns out that decade from 1990 to 2000 was actually Virgin Records' best ever decade. Although at the time, of course, we never knew it. So it was quite exuberant. It was decadent, and it was quite surreal at times. Yes.
But then you were sort of, I suppose, seduced by tech. How did that happen? When did you discover the internet? Was there a eureka moment of sorts?
Well, I didn't discover the internet. The internet was already there. But it was new to me in the early 90s, about 1993. And I'm not even sure quite how it started, but there was a famous alternative bookshop in Camden Town that was called Compendium Books, and it no longer exists, sadly. But it was the home of all kinds of alternative publications and countercultural kind of work. And in amongst the various publications that was to be found there was a magazine which is now very, very mainstream and very well known, but at the time was unheard of, and it was called Wired magazine. And now it's a Condé Nast publication and looks more like sort of Vogue than anything else. But at the time, it was pretty out there, and they started, and they talked about all kinds of different things. They weren't particularly talking about the internet, but they did start to reference it, and they used to publish FTP addresses. So FTP sites were the sort of precursor to the World Wide Web. So the web didn't exist in 1993. It was sort of invented in that year, actually. So prior to that, there were these things called FTP sites, which were basically sort of directories of files. And I got very excited about the idea that I could sit in my bedroom in West Hampstead in London and sort of leaf through the collections of works in Minnesota State University or in various Californian universities. And that was what got me going. And I thought that was terribly exciting. It shows what a sort of sad geek I was, that rather than going out on the road with Genesis, I was more interested in browsing libraries in America. But then the funny thing, what happened was that I suddenly noticed that not only were there bits of books up there, but there were also these pieces of music that people started putting up. And when I looked at what the music was, it turned out that it was lots of bands that were signed to Virgin Records. So Brian Eno tracks were very, very popular. But quite esoteric kind of techno dance bands like the Future Sound of London were being posted up there. And so that sort of made a connection with where I was. I thought, gosh, that's pretty amazing. That's going to change things, and it did.
How did Virgin feel about this? Presumably you pointed out to them that their copyrighted material was listed somewhere in somebody's folders. How did they react? Were they excited by the proposition? Were they horrified?
Well, most of the time they looked at me, and let's face it, I was still doing my day job, but I was doing an awful lot of browsing of the internet late into the night. So my complexion was getting paler and paler, I think, as the nights went on. And they were all going off to sort of after parties, after gigs and things. And I was going home to browse the internet and look at listings of books in libraries. And so they sort of, kind of patted me on the head and said, there, Jeremy, that's great. That's the future. You look after the future, and we've got a business to run here. So that was the sort of way it went.
But you were, I suppose, suitably confident that this was the future to jump ship and go into the startup world, the world of tech. How was that after the sort of relative security of a job with a record company?
Oh, it was very nerve-wracking. I mean, I spent a couple of years working within Virgin and EMI, being the guy, the go-to guy for internet deals. And that was where I sort of started to learn a bit about business, really, because what happened was that lots of venture-funded groups of engineers would come along, and I'd been transferred to Los Angeles. This is about 1998, and this was moving along a bit, but the atmosphere there was sort of febrile and crazy, and people were doing ridiculous deals. And there was a succession of kind of shiny shoed, chino-wearing developers from all over the States coming along and telling people in the record company, we're going to transform your industry. And most of the time, it was rubbish. But after a while, I kind of started to quite like these guys and thought there were some quite interesting things. And I got very excited about some of the ideas. Eventually, this group of engineers came along and had an idea for a playlist sharing music subscription service. And I went, oh, now that is a really interesting idea. Yeah, we should, that sounds really good. And I liked them. And so I kind of stepped off the edge of the cliff and went into entrepreneurial land and left EMI and moved I had two young kids with me. My wife and I, two young kids, moved up from LA to the Bay Area and joined this startup. And it, it used to take me about an hour and a half to explain to people what a playlist sharing music subscription service is. Now, most of you watching probably know exactly what I mean by that. But it used to take at least an hour and a half, and then they weren't really too sure. We were probably about 6 years too early. So it was super exhilarating to make that step. It was also, pretty nerve-wracking, really, to have gone from sort of corporate safety net into something that was pretty wild.
But you'd also moved from London to various places in America, but ultimately the Bay Area. That must have been a real change of culture to what you were used to.
It was, and I spent 2 years in LA working in the Capitol building, the Capitol Records building in LA, which was brilliant. But it was quite a shock to get used to kind of American corporate culture, which even within a record company was there to see. And I don't think any of them ever understood my sense of humor. I mean, to be fair, nobody ever does. But one of my experiences of working internationally is that you should never try and make jokes because they rarely work. But then to move from LA, which was so dominated by the entertainment industry, to move up to the Bay Area was another kind of shock and a change. But it was super exciting because this was the crucible. This was where it was all happening, and this was where Silicon Valley venture capitalists were at that point, I think, real visionaries. There really was this sense that we are reinventing a future that no one's seen here, and we are going to create a whole load of new possibilities. And in fact, a lot of the ideas that sprouted at that time it's taken us the next 20 years to actually work them out and to make them into things that work and are now part of the mainstream. So,
which we'll talk about in due course, and I suppose whether these are good things or not. But you were involved with several fledgling organizations over a period of time, and as you explain in the book, periodically there was a transaction which would change things for a business, generally the business being acquired by somebody bigger. Was that always a good thing?
No, generally speaking, it wasn't. It was generally speaking it was the opposite. So when I came back from the States after 9/11 happened, so 9/11 was obviously an incredibly difficult time for everyone in the world, and perhaps the way things are at the moment is about as close as we've been to that sort of atmosphere since, although in a very different kind of way. And I worked for a few years and built a business up called Sibelius Software, which was a music software notation company, and I was asked to help the founders build it up and sell it, and we sold that company to a very large business called Avid, who make Pro Tools, which is the most widely used recording tool in any sound recording studio around the world. And Avid also makes most of the sort of broadcast and film editing gear that's in most big studios and newsrooms. and being acquired by them was quite, yeah, it was really, really challenging, and it was the sense of being completely misunderstood, and that a large enterprise. I mean, I remember actually meeting the CTO of the company when we first started talking to them, and he said to them, he said, you know, we'll do our best not to crush you, but we do have a habit of doing that. And he said that to me, and I kind of thought, oh, well, that's very generous of him. That's so kind of him to sort of be considerate in that way. And, you know, maybe things will be all right as a result, but they turned out not to be. And there was this sort of massive uprising because we had quite a community following, and we'd created quite a sense of an online community in that business, around the business, and people posting their own scores and commenting on each other's work. And there was a real sense of working musicians and composers all working together. It was really, really exciting company. And Avid had no sense of that at all. And they didn't put any value on it, which was a great shame for the founders. But worse than that was when they tried to then kind of close things down and remove some of those community aspects. And then the community rose up and got really quite animated about the whole thing. I mean, I'd already left by then, but it was hard not to be swept up in it. And I was getting calls all the time about, well, should we try and buy them back and all this kind of stuff. It was interesting.
Does it still exist, or has it?
Yes, Sibelius exists as part of Avid. In fact, interestingly, talking about being acquired by Avid last week, I think the deal closed. They were themselves acquired by a very large American private equity group. So if any of the management is still there, they're probably experiencing something quite similar to what it was that we experienced when they acquired us. Something about larger fleas or smaller fleas have larger fleas, or the other way around. I can't remember. Anyway, there's a saying there, isn't there, about
and then you got involved more with what we might call file sharing, this idea of music being available online. You worked with various different iterations of this.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, well, I mean, obviously, look, the thing that turned the whole music industry upside down was Napster. Napster was an early file sharing solution, right? And the only problem it had was that there was no paywall and everything, and it was the entire world's music offered to everyone for free, which, you know, at the time people just went, yes, it's a blow for freedom and democracy. But, you know, unless you happen to be a record company, at which point you went, oh my God, that's my business model going down the pan. So this kind of theme of the internet disrupting business models, of enabling people to do kinds of things they've never done before, enabling content to be free, is still a battlefront. I mean, it's still a challenge for people, because essentially, once you digitize something, as we all know, it's now possible you can make a copy of it very easily, and it doesn't diminish the thing you had in the first place. So there were lots of really vicious arguments, and people who felt that their livelihoods were under threat. And interestingly, the artist community was quite divided about this, because on the one hand, there were a lot of artists who went, this is fantastic. This is a way of me getting my music out to more people than would ever spend money on it. And when they hear about it and they hear my music, then they'll want to come and see me live. And then maybe they will go and buy my CDs. And it's a great way of reaching an audience. And then there was another group who tended to be more successful and had been around for a long time, whose money was made from selling CDs at the time, who went, no, this is completely wrong. This is illegal. This has to be stopped. We've got to stamp people down. And of course, the major record companies absolutely did that. And they launched this fantastic campaign, which they called Operation Hubcap. I still don't know why they called it Operation Hubcap. I think it was something to do with young kind of hip hop kids stealing hubcaps off cars, and that was the analogy. But I don't quite know. And they started suing everybody. They sued their own consumers. They sued 300,000 lawsuits in the mid-90s. It was extraordinary. It's about 2005. Sorry, that was going on. Yeah, it was about 2005-6. Not a great way to treat your customers, really. To to launch lawsuits against them. Some of the people they issued lawsuits against weren't even alive.
Really?
It was pretty indiscriminate, yeah.
But there have been successes within that space. Apple have done very well. I don't know if the music industry has done very well as a result of that. Spotify have done very well, although interestingly, they've never made any money. Why have Apple managed to make so much money and Spotify haven't made any money?
Well, so a couple of things to say about that. I mean, one is that what all of that illegal activity did was to pave the way for the technology to become mainstream and for people to start paying for it. And in lots of ways, if it hadn't been for those really disruptive services like Napster and Grokster and LimeWire and all the rest of them, then Apple Music and Spotify and Deezer and the current streaming services, and in fact YouTube as well, probably wouldn't have come into existence in the same way. So the understanding of what it took and what the technology you needed to actually make all that happen, and what sort of business model you needed to support it, were two different things. And the technology came first, disrupted the old business model, and then people figured out how to actually make it work and make money from it. And of course, you say that Spotify's never made any money. They've never chosen to make profit because they've continually plowed a lot of money back into R&D and into marketing and promotion. We don't really know whether Apple make money out of Apple Music because they don't break out the numbers from in their reporting. So we actually don't know, but the suspicion is that they probably do quite well. And certainly the music industry in the last 5 years has absolutely come out of a trough of declining sales, and the streaming services are now actually the biggest single provider of revenue into the music industry, and the music industry is growing at a tremendous rate. So it's extraordinary when you think about that journey from looking as if all of your music was being given away for free by a bunch of pirates. Do you remember the Pirate Bay? Those guys, they kept popping up and being shut down and popping up again. And now we've, 25 years later, pretty much, we're at a point where that method of listening to music and receiving music is what's driving the entire industry, and the industry is more profitable than ever. The one downside, though, is that if you're a musician, you're a recording artist, life hasn't really got any better for you. So in the midst of all of this, corporate success has figured things out, but it's also continued to retain the kind of imbalance of power that makes it so difficult to be a musician.
And you're implying there always has been an imbalance of power.
There always has been, and I think, unfortunately, to some extent, there always will be. I mean, if you become huge and very, very successful, if you're Taylor Swift, you've got a lot of power. But if you're a starting musician or an aspiring band, life is really tough. And part of the reason it's so tough is because it's very competitive. And if you don't sign the lousy deal that someone offers you to work with them, there'll always be another band who'll come along and they will sign it. It's sometimes referred to as there's always another schmuck economic model.
Now you've innovated within a lot of corporates. This must be an interesting role, because often corporate structures are fairly rigid and not entrepreneurial, especially. So how do you go about doing that? And I'm particularly interested in what advice you would give to people who think that they too could innovate within large corporates in the way that you have.
I think I'm not sure that I have that much. I think I've fought the same fight that a lot of people have fought in trying to be sometimes people talk about an intrapreneur as opposed to an entrepreneur. So trying to be entrepreneurial inside a large corporation is really difficult. I mean, I remember one occasion, I mentioned it in the book, but where I was trying to persuade the president of EMI Europe that he should really take this internet thing seriously. And I literally chased him down the corridor and into the toilets trying to persuade him to listen to me for 2 minutes, because part of the biggest problem is just literally getting any attention from anyone if what you're trying to do is tell them about something that they're not currently focused on and isn't what their business is about. And it is incredibly difficult. One of the things that makes digital technology so disruptive and so difficult for traditional businesses to manage is the fact that you essentially have to build an entirely new business model for a digital product and a service inside the company that you're already operating. And most leaders and managers of business find it difficult enough to run the one business and keep that going, let alone run another business, which ultimately is going to cannibalize the one that they actually know about, and try and set up something that they don't really understand very well. And that's the job of the innovation team inside any corporation. And it is incredibly difficult. So at Digital Catapult, we work with a lot of innovation teams inside large corporates, and that's their biggest challenge, is actually trying to get senior management to listen to what they're saying, understand that there's a future for their business there. And in the case of the music industry, of course, in the end, the pain became so great, the level of disruption became so great that they were forced to change. But I worked away there for 5 or 6 years as things got worse and worse, going, well, how much pain do they have to go through before they're going to change? And it was a lot, was the answer.
So you've mentioned Digital Catapult. This is your day job.
Yes.
So it would be useful if you explain what Digital Catapult does, but also your view on what the role of government is in order to help with the process of digital innovation and disruption.
Well, let me explain a little bit about Digital Catapult first, and then I can talk a bit about what I think about the role of government and all of that. I think, and Digital Catapult is a part of a network of catapults. These are technology innovation centres set up and funded by the UK's innovation agency, which is called Innovate UK, and funded to help accelerate the adoption of new technology and accelerate it into the marketplace and increase commercialization, based on a view, particularly a view about the way that things work in the UK, that we're very good in universities at being very creative and very inventive, and not very good at taking those inventions and creative ideas and translating them into commercial success. And so our organization, Digital Catapult, is all about helping companies do that, helping both startups and traditional industry. And our view is really all about saying, look, if you're an early adopter, if you can be an early adopter of virtual reality or of 5G or of the Internet of Things, if you can be an early adopter of that, that will give you global competitive advantage, and you will grow as a result of that. And you'll get investment, and you'll be able to take things further. And I think we absolutely believe that. Now, as it happens, we also believe that if you digitize your business, you will also become greener and more sustainable in the process. And so what we're really driving is a green digital transition in businesses to help them become to reduce their carbon footprints. So Digital Catapult is about 300 people. We run lots of programs. We design studios and test beds and different sorts of facilities in which companies can try out the technologies. We, I suppose, over the last 8 years of having worked there, we've probably helped over 4,000 different companies, and probably, I think the level of investment that's gone into those companies is getting on for, I'm going to say, £1 billion. It's a huge number. So it's super exciting and really, really engaging. Why does it make sense? And what does that say about sort of how governments should work? Well, I think the answer is that it is really difficult to innovate. It is really difficult to be an early adopter. It's very, very risky. And whether you're a startup or whether you're a traditional business, taking those kinds of risks is hard. And so if you want to encourage people into doing that, or if you can see strategically that there's an area of business that's an opportunity for the UK, for example, in our case, then using small amounts of public money to kind of encourage people to do that and to make it slightly less risky than it would otherwise be, is what we're about. And that's fundamentally that's what government's role is. I mean, the government spends way more money funding university research than it does funding that kind of activity. But nonetheless, I think that is a valid role to use taxpayers' money. But obviously, it's taxpayers' money, so you have to use it responsibly.
So some of the successes maybe that you've achieved?
Well, let's see. Well, a great example actually of a company about 5 years ago. I met a company who were an artificial intelligence business who were focused on manufacturing processes and helping companies simplify manufacturing processes. And we introduced them to a very big American company based in Northern Ireland, in Londonderry, called Seagate, who make hard drives. And so they had they made a read-write head that had an 1,800 step production process, 1,800 different steps. The result of which was that they had huge amounts of downtime. So the process just broke down all the time because there were so many different steps, there were always so many different things that went wrong. And they've been trying to simplify it for years. And we brought in this company called Flexiton, and they sat down with them and they spent 3 weeks with them on a program that we facilitated. And at the end of those 3 weeks, they had reduced the numbers of steps in the process. They had reduced the downtime by 30%, and they'd basically done more in those 3 weeks than they'd done in the previous 3 years. And as a result of which, Flexiton then went on to have a contract with Seagate, so they continue to work with them. And in fact, the result of that was that they actually pivoted into the whole semiconductor business. And they just, I think 2 years ago, they had a Series A, £11 million investment into the business. So that journey was absolutely the kind of thing that we're doing. And we're doing that in manufacturing, but we also do stuff in the creative industries and in telecoms and in various different sectors.
Sounds fascinating. Now, you wrote another book about 10 years ago called Digital Medieval, where you claimed that the original internet dream of freedom and sharing has given way to a new medievalism, and you revisit this theme in the current book. What do you mean?
Well, I think when I wrote that first book came out, it's actually nearly 10 years ago. It's 2013. It is 10 years ago, actually. Amazing. And really what I was seeing then, I think, has continued, which is that the business model of the big tech giants is increasingly monopolistic, and that the way that they work is both in terms of consumer data, but also in terms of the way in which they create dependencies amongst other companies around them. Is kind of there's this idea, this business model, which is called a walled garden business model, which is essentially how companies like Apple or Google work, where the level of our data that they own and look after, that we put into their system, onto their platform, just grows and grows and grows until the point at which it becomes increasingly difficult to take our data away from them. And so the walled gardens start off as gardens, but they sort of grow and they become like city-states, digital city-states. And this was the sort of medieval model. And I mean, it started off as an analogy, but as I kind of developed the analogy, I realized that, yeah, actually, it has quite a lot of mileage to it. Because the other thing about those companies is there are huge numbers of other businesses which are dependent upon those platforms for themselves to survive. And whether that's living on the iTunes or the App Store in the Apple world, or the Google equivalent, those businesses are entirely dependent. So they're sort of like serfs toiling in the digital fields around these city-states, dependent upon them. And it's very difficult to move from one company to another. If you're an early stage business, you're an app developer, it's a little bit cheaper than it used to be now, but it's still quite expensive to build for both platforms, for Google, for Android and iOS. That's an overhead. A lot of companies don't choose to do that, just choose to work for one. So that sense of living in a kind of medieval period, and it being the early days of all of this, was what that was about. And that's why the current book that I brought out last year is called Towards a Digital Renaissance, because I couldn't quite bring myself to say that we had reached the digital renaissance yet, but just we could
we're not quite there yet.
We're moving towards it.
So these companies, these Silicon Valley companies, particularly social media companies, I think you're quite critical of some of them, aren't you? You don't really see them as a force for good.
Well, I think they have demonstrated an enormous amount of power, and when we see the kinds of things that happened at Facebook and the Cambridge Analytica scandal, in which so much individual personal data was siphoned off by private companies in order to then create politically influential messages, which they then use Facebook to target people with. That is a misuse of the platform, and the degree to which the platform owners are responsible for that or not responsible for that has been an enormous amount of debate. But the reality is, I think that with great power comes great responsibility, and I think what we've seen in those platforms is a real kind of hesitancy to grasp that responsibility and to really engage with it in a way that would make us all feel more comfortable. And the irony, of course, is that the level of service for free that they all provide us in an asymmetrical business model where it isn't a straight quid pro quo, is one that we all rely on. And it's very difficult to think about a world in which we don't use Google search, or we don't look at Facebook or WhatsApp or Instagram. And if you're not on Facebook and you're not on Instagram, you might still use WhatsApp. And the level of interconnection and the degree of facility that they will provide us with has seduced us all. And their enormous power comes from that. And the sense, there was a period when people started to kind of become active with the idea that we could remove our personal data and strike a blow for freedom. But the level of data that those companies manage and the critical mass that they've got is so vast that even if the entire city of Manchester were to remove all of its personal data of all of its population, it really wouldn't make very much difference to Meta. And that's the challenge that we've got. And of course, that challenge today has been made even more acute with the advent of AI and the degree to which all of that data is what has given these companies their incredible advantage in AI. So these arguments are very, very closely linked, and it's not by chance that we're talking about the same group of companies who are now arguably 7 years ahead of any other company in terms of their AI capability.
So what should we expect from AI? Because it can make our lives a lot easier, but it can also generate absolute nonsense, but believable nonsense. Which
very believable nonsense. Yes.
What's so scary about it?
Yes, mind you, I mean, we're quite capable of doing that ourselves. I'd like to say that I'm capable of producing quite a lot of scarily believable nonsense from time to time, but hopefully deliberately. I think this is a moment of technological change which is as big as when the internet hit. This is the next wave, and it arguably it's even bigger and even more wide-ranging, and certainly the speed with which it's touching everything, I think it's hard for anyone to have ignored. I don't think I've had a conversation for the last 6 months that hasn't had some reference to AI somewhere in it. And obviously the huge Bletchley conference that took place 2 weeks ago was an amazing statement about fear of this technology, and the kind of doom-laden messages that we've heard from some of the most far-sighted developers of the technology certainly makes everybody stop in their tracks and go, hang on a minute, what are we talking about here? I suppose my take on this is that clearly there are dangers here. Clearly, we are dealing with a very powerful set of technologies which are capable of not just producing hallucinations or coming out with things that aren't real, but of being used to manipulate political positions, being used to create disinformation around general elections, indeed around reporting on conflicts around the world, we are seeing in the current conflict in the Middle East a massive misinformation war taking place as well. And I'm sure that AI is being used in order to speed that up and facilitate that. So there are a whole bunch of concerns, and a lot of those were aired at that conference 2 weeks ago at Bletchley. This idea that we should all be grappling with existential questions as to whether it's climate change that's going to kill us first, or AI, I think a little bit exaggerated. And in fact, I would say what we've got to do is we've got to actually use AI as our biggest tool to fight climate change. That's actually where its role should be leveraged to the maximum. But there are lots of other things where it can do real good and be really, really powerful for industry. And I mean, that example I gave you of that company a few minutes ago is exactly the kind of thing where there's complexity that AI can solve, which humans individually or even collectively find it difficult to solve, that really, really can make a difference. So increases in productivity, our ability to be able to reduce our carbon footprint, our ability to make our cities more livable. I think all of these things are really, really exciting upsides. Not to mention our ability to make extraordinary kinds of films that it wouldn't be possible to make before, from impossible camera angles with extraordinary visual effects that no one could imagine. So the impact on the entertainment industry is going to be huge as well.
Exciting times. Just a reminder to our audience, if you do have questions for Jeremy in the time we've got left, please do type those into the Q&A facility in the next few minutes. Jeremy, what is the metaverse? What should we expect from the metaverse?
Well, the metaverse might turn out to be one of those names for some sort of technology that people got very excited about and then forgot about. So before AI was the flavor of the month, the metaverse had about a month in which it was the flavor of the month. And really, what's meant by the metaverse is a variety of different things. When we first got excited about it 2 years ago or so, it was really about the confluence of two different things. One was virtual reality and virtual environments and game worlds. So the ability to enter either in 2D or in 3D using VR goggles or augmented reality using a phone, to enter an entirely virtual, fictional world, and to meet others in it, to engage in games in it, and to spend time in there. Some people thought we might do that to do work as well. So there was that set of thoughts, and then the other set of thoughts that at the time, and since then events have overtaken it, but at the time, cryptocurrency, digital currencies, were seen as being the fuel that would drive the development of these virtual worlds. And the ability of a virtual world to create its own currency and then to start to be able to sell that to users, inhabitants of that world, created this incredible optimism and excitement. And unfortunately, as I'm sure most of the people watching this will be aware, cryptocurrency has undergone something of a crisis in the last year or so, with major failures of major exchanges, and a particular individual whose name is Fried, which is an extraordinary name for someone who was trying to develop an entirely new kind of currency, who in the end was guilty of committing a huge amount of fraud. And unfortunately, this is what we've seen in this area, which is perhaps, well, there's a lesson for all of us in the middle of that. So the metaverse was about the convergence of those two things. I think AI has, in the sort of hype cycle, has eclipsed the metaverse, but there are still lots and lots of people working on different aspects of virtual reality, virtual environments, what you might call game worlds, in the entertainment space. And alongside that, in industrial applications, people are developing things called digital twins. And digital twins are, if you like, an industrial application of what you might find in a game world. In other words, it is a model or a simulation, and it might be a simulation of a jet engine, or it might be a simulation of a city. But the idea is really coming out of computer modeling, computer simulation, to be able to model as much detail as you can about something that you're in the process of designing, such that you can try it out in different conditions and different circumstances and improve its design without ever having to build the thing. That was one use of it. The other use of it, which is really interesting, is that having done that and built a real jet engine, you could use its digital twin to operate and control it. And that's the other kind of context for digital twins. And all of these technologies, the game worlds and the metaverse, digital twins, what they have in common is a bunch of controlling software, which interestingly came out of the games industry.
We have a question from Richard Cohen. Richard asks, are there any technologies which you have seen fail or fade away, which you wish had succeeded?
Well, that's really interesting. It's amazing how we forget the things that don't succeed. There was an interesting thing that people worked quite hard on when the beginning of the digital catapult, when it was launched about 10 years ago, and this was something called white space. And there was this belief that the interval between signals, analog signals, would enable you to create different form of communication, and that you could use that space to communicate and to create a different kind of communications method. And it was sort of based on the same idea as, those of you who might be old enough to remember this, but telex and the Minitel in France was all based on those sorts of things. That it never got anywhere, and it was a theoretically an interesting idea, but it never happened. The thing that I'm always intrigued by, though, actually, the one that's always, it's not quite the example of what you were asking, Richard, but it's similar, which is that text messaging. When text messaging was invented, it was invented for telecoms engineers to communicate with each other. It was never intended that we should be sending texts to each other and doing all the things we do with text these days. It was intended to be an engineering solution for how some guy in the field could communicate with head office about what he was doing up a telephone mast. And it suddenly caught on, and here we all are. So I kind of like that example, because it's sort of something being used for totally different purpose for which it was intended, and then it taking off immensely.
It's an interesting example because it was on our phones for probably several years before anybody really started using it. And I suppose it takes two people, doesn't it? One person can't use it in isolation. You need two people, and then you're off.
Yes.
You say something interesting in your introduction, because you've spoken very confidently and fluently about your career and all this technology, but you say in the book, I've had imposter syndrome throughout my entire career.
Yes.
How have you managed to deal with that?
I'm not sure. It hasn't gone away. I think I suppose in the end, what I've realized is that having some healthy self-doubt isn't a bad thing. It's probably quite a useful thing. And I've met plenty of people who are massively overconfident in their sense of themselves in this world, who haven't necessarily that hasn't necessarily been helpful to them either. So I suppose we are all products of whatever our environment has been, and we're all the people we are. But I suppose for me, I've always had that nervousness and that trepidation. And it's only really in the last few years, and I'm quite advanced, I suppose, in my this career thing, that I've realised that I can help other people and talk to, particularly to students and to young people starting out in businesses, and that I might actually have a couple of things that I can help them with. But it took me an incredibly long period of time to believe that was the case. And I do meet people now who have such utter self-confidence, and I'm in awe of them. I just think it's amazing. But then I also sometimes just wonder, well, is that also going to get you into trouble?
Maybe it's a facade. How have you seen corporate culture change over the years you've been involved in businesses?
Well, I think it's changed. It's changed, and it's changing a huge amount. If you look back 20 years ago, and industry was run by the alpha dog, and the alpha male dog for the most part. And that meant being ruthless, aggressive. It meant having very little kind of emotional intelligence about what your colleagues or customers might be feeling or thinking, the feeling in particular. And there was that sort of sense, and I think some people still think that's how business is, and that's why business is a dirty word, is because somehow or other you've got to go around shafting people in order to be successful in business. And I really don't believe that to be the case, and I think it is changing. I think COVID changed us hugely, and there's a lot of different things that have happened in the last couple of years. Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, COVID, all coinciding to kind of change a way of thinking about business into something which I think recognizes the humanity of us as individual contributors, and that is incredibly important, it seems to me, and that didn't exist, I don't think. There was a real kind of the sense of being a corporate warrior was what you were supposed to be, and you should be out there fighting the fight, and your personal feelings and emotions had nothing to do with it. And yeah, over the years I've learned that doesn't work, and I think it's much easier to understand that within a small business than it is in a large corporate environment. Maybe that's why I like working in small teams and working with small teams more than I do with big companies. But yeah, I think we're on a massive change, and obviously the other thing that's now changing everything is this huge global experiment about where we actually work, not just how we treat each other, but the fact that we're doing this now remotely is entirely natural, and we're all happy to do it. We know what the rules are, we know the way it works. When we started COVID, none of us knew that, so we've all learned at an incredible pace, but we're still trying to figure out, how do you make that work for a business? Where does it make sense to be at home, and where does it absolutely become essential to come into an office and be together? So yeah, nothing's static. We're still
interesting times we're living in now. Towards the back of your book, there's an interesting couple of pages which is called Emissions, and this is a carrot you dangle about some of the famous people you've come across, and although you don't really tell any stories here, I'm sure you would like to, which is why you must have a tale or two about your time in the music industry that you might like to share.
I'm always so hesitant to tell stories about. I did have a night at the Brixton Academy at a Lenny Kravitz show with the Spice Girls. Nobody knew who they were, and I had to take them to see Lenny Kravitz, and they were all very excited about Lenny Kravitz and insisted on chasing upstairs. And I mean, he was happily engaged with Vanessa Paradis at the time, and I think that she probably outclassed most
all
of
of them.
Girls. But that was quite fun, trying to keep them. I was a total failure at trying to keep them under control, I can tell you. I don't know, who else do you want to know about? But I once lost Meatloaf in a cave in Berkshire. That was quite entertaining. So
what were you doing in the cave in Berkshire with Meatloaf in the first place?
So I was asked to take over the publicity for a new album that was about to come out and revive Meatloaf's career. So Meatloaf's career had been a disaster after Bat Out of Hell. He became an alcoholic and he was really unwell, and it was 10 years before he came back. And no record company in America would sign him because they thought he was a liability. But Virgin Records, in our madness at the time, decided that we would take on Bat Out of Hell too. And the world, I think, was quite grateful subsequently. But so I was in the process of trying to reintroduce Meatloaf to the public imagination. And so I thought, well, it's called Bat Out of Hell. And perhaps we better go where there's some bats. We could find a cave somewhere, and maybe I'll get a journalist or two to go and meet with Meatloaf, and he can be lurking in the bottom of a cave. So I found these caves. They weren't in Berkshire, actually. They were in Buckinghamshire. They were near Beaconsfield. They were called the Hellfire Caves. I thought, great, Hellfire Caves, Bat Out of Hell, can't go wrong. And So I took meat in our blacked out limo to said spot in the middle of the countryside, and he duly trudged down these sort of damp, dripping tunnel into these caves. And what I didn't realize was that there were multiple tunnels, and they were quite labyrinthine. And so I said to me, you stay down here, I'll go and get the journalist, we'll come back down and wander around, and you jump out of the shadows and scare the living daylights out of him. That was the plan. Problem was that journalist was late. And then when I got the journalist, we went back down in the tunnels, and I just couldn't find him. I couldn't find him anywhere. We were wandering around, and it was increasingly embarrassing. And this journalist was like, well, what are we doing down here, mate? What's going on? And I'm like, no, just bear with me. All will be revealed. And couldn't find him. And eventually came back out, and he was sitting in the limo, absolutely furious at me, freezing. And of course, I'd given him a walkie-talkie, but walkie-talkies don't work in the middle of hillsides and caves. So yes, early lessons. In the end, journalist wrote fabulous story, and Bat Out of Hell 2 sold about 30 million copies around the world. So it all worked out all right in the end. But yeah, that was a bit nerve-wracking.
So what's next? Have you got another book in progress, or something slightly different?
I don't quite know, actually, to be honest, Jonathan. There might be something else brewing. I don't think it's going to be another book about business or technology, though. I think it might be fiction this time.
Wow. Well, that will be interesting. We like fiction, and we like people who write fiction. So if you do write some fiction, do come and tell us all about it. I think your proposition, your question, the question you posed in your blurb for the talk was, do these technologies indeed empower us, or do they diminish us? So what is the answer, or is it a bit of both?
I think it's a bit of both, and what we've got to work really hard on is to make sure that they empower us and don't diminish us. I think we've got some work to do.
Well, thank you for talking to me this evening. I know our audience have stayed engaged and have been interested. This is a really interesting book. If you want to buy it, it's on Amazon. It's at good booksellers. And to thank you for being our guest today. Some of my photographs will be on their way to you in the next day or two. Excellent. Now, just a few words about our upcoming programme before we leave you. Next Monday, we welcome back Ronnie Fraser. Ronnie, if you remember, was with us about 2.5 years ago when he spoke about Jewish pilots flying in the First World War. This time, he and I will be discussing his recently published book about the BDS movement. This promises to be a very interesting and topical conversation. Then on the 29th of November, we have a live event. The author, scriptwriter, and director Jeremy Dyson, he as one of the writers of The League of Gentlemen and co-author of Ghost Stories, will be our guest. His latest novel is co-authored with Andy Nyman, The Warlock Effect. This is a thriller set in London in the 1950s, and we'll be discussing this book live at the Grammar School at Leeds. That's the 29th of November. To book for these events and for details about other future activities, please visit milim.org.uk. You can sign up to our newsletter there, and that way you make sure you don't miss anything. All online events are free. We do make a small charge for live events. Please do support our work. There's a link in the chat if you want to donate to us or visit our website. It remains for me to thank our guest, Jeremy Silver, once again. Thank you so much, Jeremy. It's been a great pleasure.
It's absolutely brilliant and lovely to be here. Thanks, Jonathan.
And looking forward to seeing you all again soon. Until then, stay safe. See you next time.